Hey, come on in and spend some time with the film hobbyist. My name is Lydia, and I love movies. We're sitting on opposite sides of a rather flat, gray, L-shaped couch in my hotel room suite. I apologize for the cramped quarters. Thank you for coming to visit me in such bizarre circumstances. Last week, an extreme, wild Midwest windstorm blew over a pine tree in my backyard onto a power line, ripping it out of our wall. No one got hurt, but the repair is rather complicated and requires a lot of waiting, so all the bureaucratic details can line up correctly. As such, the insurance company has put us up in a hotel until we have power again. We're all feeling rather displaced, even as life goes on. My husband is working remotely from that hotel desk. I still have to do the laundry, just at friends' houses instead of my own, and my kids still have to go to school and their activities every day. This is not a vacation. From our perspective as grown-ups, this is incredibly stressful. The amount of logistics and coordination, an area in which both of us struggle in ordinary times, is staggering. We miss sleeping in our own beds, living in our own house, getting to host you in my attic room. I wonder how my kids perceive this whole event. There is a lot more screen time these days, just to cope with it all, and we're pretty much exclusively eating out. Do they view this as an exciting adventure? Is this just a slight deviation from the norm? Is this a grand tragedy that they'll have to recover from? I don't know. I can't know. At this point, they're not even fully capable of describing their feelings to me. Even a 10-year-old struggles with nuanced descriptions of emotional and psychological reactions. And often, so much of it goes over their heads. I look at my own childhood with that kind of bizarre reimagining, seeing things as I did then and realizing, with adult eyes, how different the stakes were. The horrific tragedies I barely escaped, the genuine traumas I walked off, the minor inconveniences I experienced as great suffering. It's amazing how perspective changes experiences, and how time changes perspective. And this is a regular occurrence when it comes to movies. There's even a bit of an economy for this phenomenon. Does this movie hold up, being the premise for any number of podcasts, YouTube videos, behind-the-scenes TV shows? Hosts and creators will watch a movie from their childhood as an adult and comment on how it hits them differently these days. It's pretty common for the movies you watched on repeat to be absolute garbage. My aunt had recorded a Shirley Temple marathon off of Turner Classic Movies spread out among several VHS tapes, and I particularly enjoyed Susanna of the Mounties. It struck my child brain as a thrilling adventure. It strikes adult me with horror at the sheer amount of racism involved. Sometimes you watch a film from your childhood and discover that it's actually a work of art. I had that experience rewatching 1993's The Secret Garden as an adult and discovering that it was photographed by Roger Deakins, considered to be one of the greatest cinematographers of all time. More often than not, the films from your childhood sit in a liminal space of memory, half-forgotten fragments of bizarre scenes, images misremembered. All generations in which film existed have this experience, though the reasons for the misremembered differ based on technology. I'm sure that the greatest generation held unnamed silent films in their memory, lost because of sheer volume. The silent generation has a special place for film reels and shorts. Boomers and Gen Xers have fragments of TV movies or specials. For millennials, it's bizarrely acquired VHS tapes we watched on repeat. Gen Zers, straight-to-DVD films. And Gen Alpha will fight over a fever dream of streaming exclusive works or YouTube channels. As a kid with older siblings, I have a repository of clips from rented films. I'm sure some of them were acquired with the intent for me to watch them. Others I snuck into partway through or sat in the hallway listening to. As a film hobbyist, I've been able to place most of these works, though only enough to remember that I've seen them, not anything else. There was one film that I was unable to place for about 15 years. I remembered an image of a hospital bed and a stuffed toy and the feeling that something confusing and terribly sad had happened. I remembered a little girl who always carried around a bombshell. There was also a single very clear scene. There were two children, one, a girl in a pointed hat, and the other, a boy in a pea coat. And they were arguing. "I'm the fattiest! No, I'm the fattiest!" And for many years, this film remained an enigma. I was researching for a book, a speculative fiction piece heavily inspired by the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly the slow burn threat of war and the rise of resistance movements. I wanted to build a diet of World War II set media so I could put myself in this headspace. I listened to a lot of Glenn Miller, hunted down some Neville Shute novels, and watched films. I watched some well-regarded period pieces, but the best research was tracking down contemporary films. I rewatched Mrs. Miniver and Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, and as I was exploring my options, I found a bizarre little entry. Journey for Margaret. There, on the poster, was a little girl in a pointed hat. Journey for Margaret is a 1942 film directed by W.S. Van Dyke, adapted from a 1941 memoir by journalist William Lindsay White, an account of how he and his wife adopted an orphan from London. The book was considered a bestseller, and it fit a particular industry mandate in Hollywood at the time. Stories with a propagandist streak, designed to convince American audiences of why joining the fight in Europe was essential. And in its time, Journey for Margaret did just that. It was a surprise hit. The biggest standout was the girl in the title role, Margaret O'Brien, whose performance of a traumatized child orphaned by the Blitz made her a breakout star. The studio had suspected it might be so, and arranged for O'Brien, whose given name was Maxine, to have her name changed to further connect her to the film. O'Brien went on to become a notable child star for MGM, and I think it's her fame that initially gave this film a legacy. Yeah, it was a hit, but it was no Mrs. Miniver, which, if you haven't seen, by the way, wow, that's a watch. So it makes sense that this little piece would fall through the cracks. History sometimes remembers it as a melodrama. It could be labeled as old propaganda and filed away. Except, this film isn't viewed that way. It's hard to track down, but that's because its streaming rights are still valuable. It isn't available right now, but it's part of the Turner Classic Movies catalog, which means that it sometimes gets trotted out on cable and possibly put on HBO Max. It's also shown up on Mubi, which, if you aren't aware, is a streaming service for cinephiles, whose boast is curation rather than an algorithm. I've never been interested because the kinds of things picked for it are often heavy or bleak. a lot of good high art films are. And I have to be careful about that kind of media diet. Heavy food can give you indigestion. Heavy movies can affect my mental health. But if Mubi picks a movie, a human who cares about film thought that this one was valuable. This little propagandist-streaked melodrama is an important contribution to the film canon. Why? Here's the thing. The movie might have been made to persuade Americans that supporting England on the European front mattered, but the film is also a piece of journalism, too. William Lindsay White was an American journalist. He was a wartime correspondent for CBS and other news organizations in 1939 and 1940. And in 1941, he reported from London for Reader's Digest. His job was, quite literally, to explain the Blitz to American readers. His book, about his search to adopt an English orphan, is about his meeting 3.5-year-old Margaret, but it is also very much about the Blitz, about the situation in London. When the book was published in January 1941, it must be emphasized the U.S. had not even entered the war. The reason the book made such a good candidate for a wartime film was because it was a piece of journalism about what was happening in London. And as propagandist as the intentions might have been, it was still made in 1942. The London Blitz wrapped up a mere 4 months after White's book was published. In mid-1942, when this movie was filmed, things in Europe did not look great. While the Blitz was over, Germany had begun its Russian campaign and had yet to be routed. This film was released during the middle of Stalingrad, when it still looked like Germany might win. So, this film is an oddity, a World War II film made when the people involved did not know that victory was certain. And boy, does it show. I want to talk to you about why, and so I'm going to have to run down the plot for you. If this movie does become available on streaming at some point, or if you can track it down through your library, it does have a DVD release. Please do. The performances are definitely worth your time. Journey for Margaret is a fictionalized version of White's account, focused on a journalist named John Davis and his wife Nora. They flee France in 1940, heading for safer London as Nora is pregnant. John wants Nora to head back to Connecticut, but she's committed to staying with him, especially as he's lost something of his spark, and his writing shows it. He used to be angry about what was happening in Europe, but as he says, I can't keep feeling anymore. I would die if I kept feeling. One night, John decides to go out during an air raid to be able to report on the Blitz firsthand, ducking into a doorway as a shell lands on a nearby building. An air warden recruits him to dig out the mother and son sheltering in the cellar. They find the 4-year-old boy clutching his toy lamb, his face smeared with his mother's blood. John carries the boy to safety, tucking his lamb into his pocket in the process. He forgets to hand it back. When he returns to his hotel, he discovered that a bomb detonated nearby and his wife was injured. She lost their baby and had some kind of internal injury that required surgery. The Hays Code means the doctors aren't very specific, but it's clear her reproductive organs were involved, as she can no longer have children. They've killed our baby, she tells John while falling asleep from a sedative, an experience she says feels more like dying than sleeping. They've killed all our babies. Several months later, Nora leaves on a rare flight out, heading for the U.S., drunk and laughing. She's been unable to face what happened to her. John hasn't either. He's completely apathetic to the whole situation. But he still has to be a journalist, and he's reluctantly assigned to write a story on a children's home for Blitz orphans suffering from shock, run by child psychologist Trudy Strauss. There he encounters a familiar-looking little boy, bleary-eyed and dazed, hardly speaking. It's Peter, the 4-year-old he pulled from the rubble, and John is able to return his stuffed lamb, an act which prompts the boy to become more connected to reality. John is also present when little Margaret is brought in by her foster mother. She's been in several homes, but isn't adjusting well. Sulky, as her foster mother reports. Margaret is steely-eyed and has a tic of rubbing away imaginary tears with the heel of her palm. Ms. Strauss realizes that she has been punished for crying and gives her permission to sob as loudly as she wants. Because of John's connection to both of these kids, he's persuaded to stay for the rest of the day, and both children fight over him, calling him "My Mr. Davis." A few nights later, while out covering the air raids, John stumbles on a delirious mother, still carrying her dead child, and something wakes up in him. He begins to pray, "Oh God, let me stay mad. Give me the wisdom. Give me the strength to stay mad." He grows closer to the children, and when they are brought to potential foster parents, they cling to him instead. John decides to try and adopt them and writes to Nora. Initially, she has a nervous breakdown, but is finally able to face what happened to her and agrees to bring both children to the U.S. John has a rare ticket out of London on a flight, but the limited space means the children can only come if he forgoes his luggage and convinces another passenger to as well. Initially, only Margaret is able to come, to her great anger, but at the last minute, another passenger agrees to let Peter come in place of her luggage. They fly to Lisbon and then sail to the U.S. on a boat, arriving just a few days after Pearl Harbor. Nora joins them as they wait in the bay, and the new family comes together for the first time, just as the lights of New York City are turned off for the blackout. When we tell the story of the Blitz, we do so with assumptions. You know what an air raid siren sounds like. You have an idea of what an air raid shelter looks like. You've seen footage of bombed-out cities. You know what war orphans look like. You also know that the Blitz ended. You know that England won, that Germany never crossed the English Channel. None of that is assumed in this film. Early on, John and Nora go down to the air raid shelter for the hotel, only to find that it's full. The camera pans to show guests sleeping in cots, and as the planes whine overhead, one guest covers her ears and begins sobbing. A child recites, "Now I lay me down to sleep," and the line, "If I should die before I wake," hits a lot harder. I'm convinced that some of the scenes of John out during the air raids used actual news footage. There's a clear cut and change of film quality, and there are real blazes and real ruined buildings in the footage. Some of the footage in the background was clearly a special effect done on a soundstage, but not all of it. In this way, Journey for Margaret shows us what audiences did not know, what they did not take for granted. It gives us a snapshot of feelings at the time, which, yes, included the hope of children like Margaret having a future if people will fight for them, but also included the psychological realities of war. We have so many words today for what happens in this film. John, at the beginning, is clearly suffering from compassion fatigue. Nora disassociates after her miscarriage. Peter and Margaret have PTSD. One child at the children's home has a flashback, screaming at the top of her lungs as she sees John, remembering the man who took her away from her dead mother. The people who made this film understood enough to depict it, but we know so much more now. What happens to minds? What happens to bodies? I picked up none of this as a child. I knew it was sad, but I didn't understand why, or what was happening, or that any of this was real. What I remembered was the little childhood details. Margaret always carries the shell of an incendiary bomb slung over her shoulder. She refuses to part with it. And she and Peter express delight over the bombed-out buildings, always looking for a proper bomb. And these are the kind of morbid things that children of the time absolutely incorporated into their everyday lives. And they were vivid to me because they spoke to my childhood perspective. I watched World War II movies with a sense of adventure. The Blitz was the reason the Pevensies had to leave London for a magical house in the country. World War II was why the heroine of Number the Stars had to do dangerous, exciting things to protect her Jewish best friend. It was the inciting incident in Snow Treasure for the Norwegian children to help smuggle gold bars out to help the war effort, hiding them under their bellies as they sled past Nazi soldiers, burying the gold under snowmen for the resistance to collect later. I read these and watched these with a child's perspective, just as Margaret and Peter experienced them with a child perspective. I don't know how much of this trauma they carried with them into adulthood. Would Peter remember the bomb falling on his house? Would Margaret remember being abused for crying? Would these realities come out in their lives anyway as confused adolescents? Watching this film as an adult, it's remarkable how John Davis's prayer to stay mad feels relevant. That sorrowful rage can fuel action to care for children in all manner of terrible circumstances. In war, in systemic injustice, in domestic abuse. But it's also remarkable that, while championing empathetic rage, it also does so from hope. From this film's perspective, victory was hardly a sure thing. Europe had remained under fascist control for years. Pearl Harbor had brought war to American shores. The lights of New York City had to be turned off. As Nora tells Margaret and Peter, all the lights in all the cities in all the world will have to go out until the war's over. But John, now filled with a reason to care, with two reasons to care very deeply, says that they will come back on again. And even as my life has changed, even as time marches on, these words aren't just a propagandist statement meant to support the war effort, but a reminder that one day the traumas and the sufferings will be behind us, and we will look on them with new understanding, new realities of the stories we have lived through. "Do you promise?" demands Margaret. "Will I see?" "Yes, Margaret. You'll see." Thanks for coming.